Alright, so today I wanted to talk about the new Deeds of Flesh album, Nucleus. This is a band that I grew up loving in the late 90s. I kind of looked at them as having three distinct periods. The first three records were kind of like an organic, like suffocation-y type of style, a little more notey. What they kind of did was a lot of the similar picking patterns to a band like Cynic, like a double picking of a melody, but with a much more like sinister scale, and they combined that with like the percussive aspects of what Suffocation was doing. Um, and a lot of people agree that they peaked with Path of the Weakening, which I also agree with. My favorites are Path and Inbreeding the Anthropophagi. And then they had kind of a mid period where they got a little bit stale. Their sense of melody kind of went by the wayside, and they put out three records that were pretty interchangeable, nothing really noteworthy, and they clearly were in need of some kind of stylistic change of sorts. What they did after that was a bit of a extreme departure from the sound that everybody knew them to have, and they adopted like a more modern metal, metalcore, deathcore type of thing where the concentration was less on the clever arrangements and the melody carrying the songs. It was more of a percussive, like rhythmic aspect that was the backbone of what they were doing. And they went from having this organic style where the whole presentation felt like a real band to a very robotic, uh, alien kind of tone. And I definitely don't prefer that kind of material. I like technical metal, but they went for more of the scalar route, and they interspersed that with your basic open rhythmic chugs that I think are the downfall of modern metal songwriting. So, that being said, I am glad this record happened because it's a posthumous type of thing where the main songwriter, Eric Lindmark, died, I think, 2 years ago, and everyone assumed that that was going to be the end of the band. And then they started dropping a few teasers that there was some life going on with the project, and then they, out of nowhere, kind of put out this record. And they view it as the end of the trilogy that they started with the Of What's to Come record when they went kind of space age stuff. And this, I think, is probably the culmination of what they were trying to do with that style, and I want to love the record, but it's just kind of not what I wanted the band to go out on. It would be great to look at this project, which is an extreme labor of love. They managed to get the surviving members of the band, got a lot of guest stars in there to make the record happen, which is great. You love to see it, but there's something about the whole affair that's very sterile, and if this is how the band goes out, which it probably should, it doesn't have the finality that I would expect from a band that has a legacy reaching several decades. What we have here is kind of the culmination of the modern style of extreme metal. Not much death metal in here, not much Deeds of Flesh in here. The elements that are Deeds of Flesh sounding, like I mentioned, the double picked melodic lines, unfortunately are not melodically interesting enough to give the songs on here any lasting power and make them memorable in any way. And you wind up latching on to the elements they brought in from modern metal, such as those open chugs and the rhythmic syncopation. And you know, that's all well and good, and if it's the type of thing that they had envisioned being the next and final step of the band's career, I'm not going to say they weren't successful, because this is kind of a mixing and performance piece of art in a way. The elements of the record that make it what it is are strikingly impressive. You know, the musicianship is insane. The recording aspect is crazy. You know, it sounds pristine. Like every element of the guitar approach it's almost as if they recorded everything as a down pick and pieced it together, which I don't really like as a modern recording staple. But if you're going to try to make a very robotic sounding record, they've pulled it off, and the guitar tone is menacing. It's got a good amount of stab to it where you really feel the percussive leanings that they're trying to go for. But I'm torn because the elements that sound like the Deeds of Flesh I grew up with are less interesting than the benchmarks of the modern metal that came in that I think are kind of handicaps for modern metal structuring. And you know, I find myself only remembering the rhythmic elements and the calls to the modern like deathcore type of style, which I am not a fan of. The solos that they bring in are more of a texture than anything because they're your typical Hal Leonard sweepy kind of scale that isn't really indicative of the player's tonality so much as it is an exercise that presents a backdrop over the syncopated rhythms. And that's all well and good, but there's nothing there that is going to have like a timeless appeal for me. You could see that if you were to go back and look at the periods of the band, even with the cover arts alone, they went from having like a painted, organic kind of appearance to what they wanted to do to more digital, more robotic, less human. And when you get away from that, you kind of get away from the elements of death metal that I like to see presented. Because when you're gonna try to get a death metal project off the ground, you have to remember that what you're exploring is the finality of life, the idea of the death process. And when you bring in this robotic element of it, you're kind of just taking any of that organic life out of it, and you're not being confronted with any kind of conflict that comes from, you know, the life or death scenario. It becomes more of an exercise. It becomes more of just background noise. And you know, like I said, I really wanted to like this, you know, and I don't hate it. I think that of the 3 records, it's probably that represent the end of their career, the last 3 records that represent the stylistic change, it's probably the best one. And it is great to see everyone come together to try to make something happen here out of nowhere. It's an important record, it really is. It shows that there was a brotherhood in that second wave of percussive death metal, and it also probably represents the end of that sound. I don't really see us going back to that sound. I think the modern approach of like scalar melody and interspersed with rhythmic chugging is kind of where we're at and where we're going to stay. So this is kind of a big deal in terms of representing the nail in the coffin of that style, and they couldn't even present it in that way because those elements of modern songwriting already came in and infiltrated the process of what makes death metal what it is. So that being said, I don't think it's a terrible record. It's got parts that will pique your interest, but it's more of a record that you can step back and think, wow, this is a lot of work went into these songs, but it's not coming from a place of real inspiration behind what they're doing, aside from, oh, I just wanted to make the most like syncopated, choppy, technical in terms of like amounts of changes per phrase record that I could, while still kind of losing the structure and the melody of what makes a song in the process. There are a few parts of the record that are memorable. Um, I think the third song has a couple of themes that they come back to over and over that really flesh it out as being a song, and they kind of have weird permutations around it where they will return to a theme that introduced the song and then have a bunch of things affect that melody, which I really like to see in a song. I think that really develops the song's character. But then they have songs where everything will stop completely, and then they'll go into a completely different tempo, completely different melody, and that to me is one of my least favorite metal tropes or songwriting trope, because that to me represents two different songs. So you have some strengths and weaknesses here, and I think that you can pinpoint the issues with this band with who Eric Lindmark surrounded himself with towards the end of the band's career. Bringing in some of the later unique leader players from a band called Archaic, who were part of that departure from organic sounding death metal, leading into the modern metal style that we have today, where it's more percussive, more scalar, less about creative structure, less about songs having individual characteristics. And aside from a few moments here, all of these songs are pretty interchangeable, and that's really unfortunate. But I would like to know just how much the new blood in this band had to do with the actual structuring of the record, whether or not they contributed actual riffs or if it all came from Eric Lindmark. That being said, I am glad the record happened. I don't like the idea of someone dying and not having their legacy concluded the way they wanted to. And obviously they were working on this record when he passed, and it's good to see it come out. It's good to see that a lot of people cared enough to come together and make the record happen. But aside from it being a feat of performance and mixing, it unfortunately doesn't have any kind of resounding presence as an important death metal record. So those are my thoughts on that. If this is the end of the band, it was cool that they brought it together, but as for me, I think that they peaked a much longer time ago with Path of the Weakening, and that's the deeds I'd like to remember. So thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.